Hi, today we're going to talk about the menu settings on an OM1 camera. I'm going to go through all the menus as I've got them set up. Now the problem with doing a film like this is it goes on rather too long. It could be over an hour, so I have to find ways to shorten it. So I'm not going to talk about the video settings, I'm not going to talk about flash nor playback. I think playback's quite simple to sort out, and there'll be one or two other settings I'll skip over. Only settings related to wildlife photography am I going to talk about. It's all that I know about. So I'm going to divide it into three as well. So this week I'm going to do settings set 1 and set 2, the tabs from left to right, and I've already done the third set, which is autofocus. I've already covered that. I've got a YouTube film out on that, so I'll put a link in the description to the autofocus settings. And then next week, having skipped the video, the flash and the playback settings, that leaves us with the cogwheel and the wrench tool settings. So I'll cover those next week. If I'm talking about a setting that I regard as important, I'll say so. If it's just a personal choice, I'll say so. So we're going to start off with the left-hand set of menus, set 1, basic settings and image quality. And the top line is custom mode. Now in many ways we should be doing this at the end when we set our camera up, because this is where you have the ability to save your settings as C1, C2, C3 or C4. It's an incredibly useful feature. I could not use a modern camera without it. You could save C1 for birds in flight, C2 for landscape photography, etc. Once you've saved those settings, you can recall them simply by turning the top dial to C1 through to C4. Or simply switch the camera off, back on, and it will reload the settings that the dial is set to. It means if you ever get into a mess with your camera, you're not too sure what's happening, menus are greyed out, etc., you can always reload those settings that you saved when everything was working perfectly. So you press the OK button, you choose which mode you want to save, so we're picking on C1. So then we want the second line down, assign. We're going to assign the settings to C1. There's a confirmation message, we hit set, and that's it. We have saved all the settings in the camera to C1. The third line down, save settings, that's a bit confusing. It's got two options, reset and hold. When you're in reset, then any changes you make in the camera are not automatically saved to C1, and I can't see why you'd want it any different. If you have it in hold, as you make changes on your camera, it automatically updates C1. Seems to defeat the object to me, so I always make sure I have that in reset. Recall simply recalls the settings that you've saved as C1. Don't normally have to do that here, just by switching the camera off and back on it will recall. Second line down is where you decide if you're going to shoot JPEG or RAW. Well, I shoot RAW. This is very much a personal choice. The world of wildlife photography is divided about 50-50. Half of us shoot RAW, half shoot JPEG. If I was going to shoot JPEG, I would shoot the largest file size, large super fine. And I think you've got to have a specific reason to shoot smaller. And you can shoot both JPEG and RAW at the same time. So I'm choosing RAW. Detailed settings. This is where you can change the size of those JPEG files if you want to. You'd have to have a very specific reason to do this, but you can take the left hand one, you can make it smaller, you can change the compression, but you're not normally going to want to do that. You'd normally leave them as they are. Image aspect, well, it's a 4:3 ratio camera. That's what you normally have it set to. You can change it, for instance, to 3:2 ratio or even a square format. It doesn't affect your raw files, it's only affecting those JPEGs. You can see the bottom one now is 768 by 768 pixels. Again, you need to have a specific reason for wanting to do that. Normally you'd keep that at 4:3. Image review. This is an important one. When you take a burst of pictures, you can have it so that the last picture in the sequence remains on the screen in the viewfinder for 2 seconds or 1 second, whatever. And I find that really annoying. As soon as the sequence is finished, I want to go back to the shooting mode again, ready to take the next picture. So I always keep that off. Shading comp. There are some lenses that may cause a bit of shadowing in the corners, vignetting. If you have that on, it will compensate for it. Only works in JPEG again, so it doesn't affect me, and I don't have any lenses that cause shading. I don't know which lenses do, there won't be very many. So on to page 2, picture mode. None of these settings affect me because I'm shooting RAW. I can change all of these when I'm RAW processing, but if you shoot JPEG, maybe there's one or two you need to set up. Picture mode, you can choose various colors, so we can have a muted color, natural color, vivid color. I would keep that on natural if I was shooting JPEG, and there's all sorts of art filters up here as well, not really relevant to wildlife photography. So initially, unless you have reason to change it, I would keep that on natural. Then coming down the left hand column, you can change the sharpness, the contrast, the saturation, graduation. So I don't have to change these, but if I did, I think I would leave all of those at the default setting. Picture mode settings, here you can untick some of those options. So if you never use muted, for instance, you could untick it, then it will never appear in that previous menu. A lot of work to do that, I wouldn't bother. White balance, I would keep to auto, but you can change it to sunny conditions or shadow or cloudy. Normally I'd keep that on auto. White balance compensation. You've really got to know what you're doing here, and basically I wouldn't touch it. Keep warm colours on. If I was shooting JPEG, I guess I would keep that on, but it's a personal choice. White balance for flash. We're not talking about flash. Colour space. sRGB if you're going to do a lot of printing. I send my stuff off to picture libraries. Everything I take goes to the picture libraries, so I would set it to Adobe RGB, but I can do this during the raw processing, but that's the standard for sending off to the picture libraries. Page 3, the top 3 lines here relate to auto ISO, which I don't use. I like to set the ISO myself, but if you shoot auto ISO, the top line is where you set the upper limit for your ISO, where you don't want it to go above, and you can set the default ISO or the lower limit as well. The second line down is where you set the shutter speed, where you wish auto ISO to start to work. So at the moment it's set to 2/50th of a second. Once you get lower than that, the ISO will start to increase, so it will keep it at 2/50th of a second. Or you can choose auto, which is where the camera determines what shutter speed it will start to increase the ISO at. And the camera uses information about what lens you've got fitted and what image stabilizer setting you've got to determine what shutter speed it will start to increment the ISO. The third line down, you can determine whether you have the auto ISO work in manual mode as well as program mode, aperture priority and shutter speed priority. So you just got those two choices. ISO step, this is an important one. I never have the ISO step in 1/3 increments. I change that to 1 stop increments. That means I'm going from 200 to 400 to 800, 1600 ISO in whole stop increments. I'm not interested in 1/3 of a stop increments. There's no difference between them. It's very hard to see a difference between whole stop increments, let alone 1/3 of a stop. And it means I don't have to turn the dial so many times to increase my ISO. Noise filter, this one is for the noise filter when you're shooting at high ISOs. I always do my noise reduction post-processing, so I'm going to switch that to off. Although again, it doesn't really affect me because it doesn't apply to RAW files, only JPEGs. And this one is for low ISO processing, but not noise reduction. It gives priority to the drive, the frames per second, or the detail. Very hard to see any difference between these two at all. I keep it on drive priority, but you really are going to struggle to see any difference. Then another noise reduction, but this is for long exposures. Again, I would just switch it off. I want to do all that in post-processing, not leave it to the camera. So on to page 4. Flicker scan, that's for artificial lighting, so it doesn't affect me as a wildlife photographer. Exposure compensation, I do keep that in 1/3 increments. I tend to think in 1/3 increments for the exposure compensation. You can have it in half stops or full stops. Exposure shift, if you feel your camera is constantly over or underexposing, you can set the compensation up on a permanent basis. And you can do it for 3 different metering patterns. So if you're using spot metering and you feel the camera always overexposes when you do that, you can change it here, half a stop under or half a stop over, and leave it like that permanently. Page 5, metering. Personal choice, but I use the evaluative or the matrix metering. I always think the important thing is not to use all of them. That would make life too complicated. I try and use one metering pattern and learn when I've got to over or underexpose. None of them will get it right all of the time, so you're always going to have to compensate one way or the other. If you use one metering pattern, you stand a chance of learning over a period of time when you need to compensate. Metering during automatic exposure lock. I've got that set to auto, which means it uses the same metering pattern as the line above. So the evaluative metering here, you can change it so that when you're using AEL, you could be spot metering just for that moment. The AEL auto reset, I've got that set to no. That means that when I release the button, the exposure still remains locked. If I change it to yes, then when I release the button, it automatically resets the exposure. AEL by half depressing the shutter release button. I've only got this set up for the single autofocus, and since I never use single autofocus, it doesn't really affect me. I'm in continuous focus all of the time these days. I could have it on for continuous autofocus by putting yes, but I don't, or I can switch it off completely. So in effect, because I don't use single autofocus, in effect I've got it switched off. It's the same as having it off, but very much a personal choice as to whether you want to use that or not. But when I'm in continuous autofocus, I don't want the exposure to be locked. I want it to keep changing. Metering during sequential shooting, you can have that yes or no. If it's yes, then every frame in a sequence it remeters. If it's no, then it only meters the first frame and it keeps that exposure for all the other frames. Spot metering. If you keep these 3 options ticked, then the spot meter is in the middle of the focus frame. So if you have a limited focus frame, a smaller area rather than the full picture, the spot metering will be in the middle of that focusing frame wherever you put that focusing frame. Doesn't affect me because I'm not spot metering. Page 6 is flash, so we don't have to deal with that. We're going to skip it completely. Page 7, drive. This is your frames per second. At the moment that's set up for just one picture in mechanical mode. Normally I'm using this one, which gives me 20 frames per second. That's for a static bird on a branch. And I also use SH2 for birds in flight. That gives me 50 frames per second continuous focus. So those are the 2 that I use the most often. We've also got the Pro Capture options here, 3 of them, and self-timer options. That's all about the frames per second, very much a personal choice. Anti-flicker shooting again is to do with lighting, artificial lighting. Sequential shooting settings, you can change them here. So we can go into the one I use the most often. Let's say SH2. You can go into there and change it so that it's not 50 frames per second, it's 25 frames per second. I always want it on the maximum, and I don't want to set a count limiter, a maximum number of pictures it will take. I'll leave that off. Self-timer settings not appropriate for wildlife photography. Anti-shock settings, again, not relevant for wildlife photography. It's when you're using a very slow shutter speed in mechanical mode, the camera will automatically turn to electronic mode to avoid any shock effect of the shutter moving. Silent settings, very confusing one this. I've got them all off, but that's really the only one to do with noise. This is the bleeping that the camera makes. I've got that switched off, but it's not all about silent mode. It's the AF illuminator and flash mode. Anyway, I've got them all switched off. Page 8, image stabilizer. I always keep that on auto, whether I'm on a tripod or not, it makes no difference. The manual tells you you should switch it off when you're on a tripod, but when I look through a telephoto lens on a tripod, there is lots of vibration there, plenty of work for the image stabilizer to do. All these other options, so difficult to test and prove. I don't have an issue, so I always just leave it on auto. Image stabilizer, frames per second, you can give priority to the image stabilizer so it's doing a better job, or to the number of pictures you're taking per second. I'd rather it concentrated on frames per second, but another one, impossible to prove it one way or the other what difference that is making. Image stabilizer, when you half depress the button, do you want it to come on when you half depress the button? Well, I do. You can switch it off, but I do want that to come on as I half depress the shutter release button. Handhold assist is for long exposures when you're hand holding, not relevant to us. Lens image stabilizer priority, this relates to third-party lenses and the OM100 to 400. I would keep it off, giving priority to the image stabilizer in the body, but I have not tested it extensively. So on to the second set. Even less settings here we've got to worry about. Nothing on the first page at all is relevant for wildlife photography. Digital teleconverter I never use in stills mode. I do use it in video mode, but not for stills. I would rather do any cropping in the computer afterwards, and that's what it does. It's a 2x crop, and then it interpolates the picture to bring it up to the same file size again, and the quality is quite good. But whatever the camera can do, you can do the same and get the same quality on the computer. Nothing else on that page is relevant to us. So the last page again, I don't do any bracketing at all. And that's the first two sets. So I've already got a YouTube film on the autofocus settings. I'll put a link to the autofocus settings film in the description underneath the video, and next week we'll look at the cogwheel and the wrench tool. Thanks for watching.